You're describing unfortunate warfare that breaks out between Gentiles and Jews periodically, and it's called anti-Semitism, but obviously it's a, a two-way street. Is that what you're
If you look at the Inquisition, for example, I wrote a book called Separations and Contents, and it deals with various anti-Semitic anti-Jewish movements, and all of them were deeply involved with Jewish domination of one kind or another. The fact is that Jews are an extremely talented group. If you they're more intelligent than Europeans.
They have the highest measured IQ in the world. These are the Ashkenazi Jews.
I'm talking specifically about Ashkenazi Jews. But the Sephardic Jews, what happened in Spain is really remarkable. I mean, in the 15th century, there were these Jews were forced to convert to Christianity, and then they decided to, well, that's just, so they remained overtly Christian, but they rose right to the top of Spanish society and started dominating. I mean, all of the wealth, the elite, the political influence on the king and so on, everything. And so it produced this backlash among the old, and that was the Inquisition, basically, in a nutshell, of course. But the point is that this was a very talented group, and they had left a very large imprint in the trading channels around the world. When they were expelled from Spain, they went up to Amsterdam and really made Holland into a world power for a while. So this was a very talented group, that extremely talented intellectual elite did not survive really into the 20th century. But the Ashkenazi Jews did, and they had a huge population explosion in Eastern Europe. This is a very talented, very energetic, extremely intelligent group, and that's why, certainly other groups, we talk about blacks and Jews, if you think of the contrast there, early in the century, where
that's why a lot of white conservatives have always been suspicious of the alliance, given the fact that blacks in Israel are not given the special alliance status that they enjoy here with Jews in the United States.
That's true.
Crypsis, as you've used in your book. The word crypsis appears continually. Is that what you often allege?
Well, especially in times past, that has been a theme. Jewish crypsis, it was very important in the Spanish Inquisition period, because these people were overtly Christians, and they said they were Christians, but they kept hanging out with each other, they kept marrying each other, kept
were they advancing specific Jewish interests to attain greater political power?
They remained a group, but a sort of submerged group that were not overtly Jewish. You see, they didn't, and in fact, they expelled the Jews in 1492 because they didn't want these so-called new Christians to associate with the old Christians.
Well, we're going to move on to Freud in a moment. What were the immigration events of 1924 and then 1965? Because I think they've had a profound impact on today's country, and with more to come. But what happened in 1924 briefly, and then of course 1965, which was also extremely significant.
The law of 1924 was a major defeat for Jewish organizations. Jewish organizations had basically kept immigration going. If you were taking a poll around 1900, the majority of Americans wanted to end immigration. They thought that we had enough people.
But that's been an attitude that's been going on forever. What happened in 1965? I know that the Jews didn't get the open admissions that happened in 1955. What changed in 1965, which has opened up the borders to Mexico and other places in the Third World?
Well, you had the immigration law of 1965, and again, Jewish groups were the main organizers of the people on that side. I mean, they were the ones funding.
And what do? They changed it so we no longer give preference to people of European extraction.
Right, so that you got rid of all these national origin things, and they started to have quotas for all parts of the world. And as soon as the law was passed, you started to have the activists were trying to get more and more actual numbers. In other words, to bump up the numbers, because the immigration law of 1965 was advertised as not changing the ethnic balance of the country. I mean, Teddy Kennedy famously said this won't change it.
Yeah, but did they know? Did they design?
I think so, because it's a matter. Well, it's deception or something. I mean, I think that the fact is the activists, as soon as the law was passed, tried to bump the numbers up.
Well, in other words, why are both political parties today paralyzed as far as grappling with an issue that's popular with the American people, namely stopping illegal immigration?
It's one of the most amazing things. Yeah.
Is there a Jewish angle to that?
Well, I think the Jewish angle is more difficult to trace at this point. I mean, it is the case that all the major national Jewish organizations are members of the Immigration Forum, which is the major pro-immigration lobby. But you also have a huge, in California, there's a huge involvement of Mexican activists in favor of immigration.
Right. But
so you have business activists. It's not a simple story anymore.
Yes, right. But now, of course,
and I think you have a feed-forward situation now where the more immigrants you get, the more there's going to be pressure to increase the amount of immigrants.
Well, let me ask you another question about Sigmund Freud, another one of these brilliant Jewish intellectuals, obviously the father of psychoanalysis. You say psychoanalysis, Freud's movement, remains fundamentally an ethnic movement? And we're getting low on time here.
Even, yeah. Well, it certainly was at the beginning, all of these psychoanalysts at the beginning. And it remained that way, the core. Again, there were a few non-Jews brought in, like Ernest Jones. But I'm not making this up. This is a lot of people will tell you this. Psychoanalysis is definitely in a downward spiral. I mean, the fact is, 100 years after the so-called Oedipal complex, we have never found it. Nobody's ever found any evidence for it.
So it's a failed science, but of course his reputation remains...
yeah, he was almost elected Man of the Century by Time magazine. And if you talk to the average person in the street, and they say, who's the most important psychologist ever? Freud would be the #1. And Freud is still regarded as a great scientific figure.
How did he advance specifically Jewish interests?
Well, I think he thought of himself as someone who was battling Western culture. He thought of himself as Hannibal.
So he wanted to deconstruct a lot of myths about what noble, maybe even spiritual myths a lot of Christians cling to as far as the things that motivate them from day to day. Is that it?
In other words,
he offered a more cynical...
You thought you were motivated by the highest civilization and all that, but you're motivated by the fact that you had the sexual repressions, and that's producing... So in other words, it changes your view of yourself. And as I say, he himself thought of himself as combating Western culture, as someone who's battling this general Hannibal, who's from Carthage against Rome. Rome is the West. Carthage is the East. It's
let me move on, because we have a couple more intellectual movements to cover. Sociology, a new science in the last 100 years, but the Frankfurt School of Social Research. Tell me a little bit about that.
The Frankfurt School of Social Research began in the 1920s in Germany. It was funded by a Jewish millionaire named Weil, I believe, and they established this institute, the Frankfurt, at the University of Frankfurt. That's why it was called that. These people were on the political left. They were Marxists, but they were, sort of sophisticated Marxists, and they started to have doubts about Marxism with the rise of Hitler, because that showed that Marxism itself could not appeal enough to these working class people who gravitated to Hitler eventually. Hitler was very popular. So anyway, as soon as Hitler came to power, he expelled them from Germany. They came over to this country, and that's when a lot of their most influential research was done. They wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality. It's funded by the American Jewish Committee. All the central figures in this movement were Jewish. Max Horkheimer.
Max Horkheimer, you say?
Yeah, he was the head of the Frankfurt School, and then T.W. Adorno was another major player. And the point of the authoritarian personality was that ethnic prejudice is a psychopathology, that there's something wrong. It's not just that you're, mean-hearted or have... so
it's actually a sign of mental illness.
Mental illness. You're something.
And didn't Freud do the same thing?
It's similar, and they drew a lot on Freud. If you look at the authoritarian personality, there are whole chapters where they, it's very psychoanalytic. But it's a little bit of a twist, and it was more. It had a very large influence, because at that time you had the rise of the human relations movement, which was basically funded by the ADL and these other Jewish organizations.
ADL.
Yeah, and you started to have all these programs in the school system.
I remember hearing about the authoritarian personality when I was in grade school in New York City. They linked Nazism to. I remember them saying that they were lower education. They kept making the link between lower education and lower income, not motivated to anything more than, I guess, I don't know.
I think that actually that's another aspect of Jewish intellectual movements I haven't really discussed much, is this sense of intellectual superiority.